and you are listening to Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. If you are listening for the first time, I interview leaders who inspire me in the areas of hardcore IT security, IT business leadership, innovation, creativity, entrepreneurship, and fearless living principles. Welcome to the show. Well, I just wrapped up this really powerful session with 5 CIOs in this mastermind group. And anytime you get that many minds working together, you come up with great ideas. And that's what we got today. We had 14 new ideas that came out of this session. And these ideas centered on how do you build high performance teams, and how do you incentivize employees? How do you eliminate a toxic culture and reduce a toxic culture? How do you use the cloud as a force multiplier? How do you build a job board so that you find latent talents and create opportunities for your staff to perform? So I'm only just touching the surface, but I think you'll really, really enjoy this show a lot. And if you do, please go to iTunes and leave your comments there. The iTunes judges the quality of the shows by the comments that are left there. And I appreciate you for listening, and let's jump right in. Welcome to the Mastermind podcast. I've got a couple incredible guests today that I want to make sure we're introduced to you before we get into the main episode. We have Jim Gorig, who's the CIO of Wiley Rhine, Donald Wagner, who's the Managing Director of the Corporate Executive Board, Neil Guernsey, who's the CIO of STG, Nick Dreyfus, who's the CIO of MicroStrategy, and Jim DePietro, who's the CIO of Bowman Consulting. So let's get started with the team building. So Jim and Nick, why don't we look at you guys' individual items and as well as Neil, and kind of give a summary of what you have written for us, and then let's everybody comment to that. So let's start with Nick. Nick, give us a kind of little overview of kind of culturally where you're at and some of the things you're looking to kind of right size within the organization, because that's definitely shared across at least 3 or 4 of the guys on the phone here.
Sure. It's pretty easy to describe how we solve it. It's going to be an interesting issue for me. The issue that I'm struggling with is I've got an application stack and a team that is about 15 years behind where the current state of technology is. And so that means the ability to change the skill sets, the understanding of how technology has changed and what tools are available and how to solve problems. All of that's missing across the board.
So there's a complete gap in really knowledge that you think goes back that far?
It does go back that far. So, I mean, when you look at the stack, they've been supporting the stack for a while. They do a good job at that, right? That's great. Even when it comes to thinking differently today. So, for example, let's say, if I want to build a new enterprise application today, rather than build the entire thing in-house, my first question is what, for example, can I get from Amazon that's ready to go in terms of installed infrastructure? And how do I architect a solution that makes best use of the cloud, whether it's the internal cloud or whether it's something like Amazon, for example? Those types of questions don't come up because it's a client-server team.
Interesting. Jim Gorig, is that why you're looking at the hybrid cloud, is for potentially to address some, hoping to rent that expertise in the cloud versus developing it internally?
I think that's exactly it. From our standpoint, we're a little bit smaller shop and don't have the depth of resources that you might find in a larger organization. So we need to seek out those opportunities where we can, and we view the hybrid cloud as a nice match from that perspective. Being able to take advantage of skill sets that we may not have available to us internally, as well as being able to explore new options that we may not have the time or the capacity to do internally. So I do think that it brings on a different set of skills that you might need internally, which would be the appropriate folks that would be able to manage that process and those vendors for you.
Jim, this is Jim DePietro. I'm just curious, can you give an example of an application or a platform you use for the hybrid cloud?
Sure. We're really beginning to explore it right now, and our initial interest in this is really to look at identity and access management and how we can extend that beyond our borders and provide some seamless capabilities in that space. So, one of the things that we're looking at right now is potentially using Azure to place our AD environment there and be able to use that as a single sign-on platform for a lot of services that we use externally. But that's not necessarily something that we want to look to support in-house.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. I'm seeing the same thing. I need a messaging platform rather than install a whole services bus internally. I'd much rather buy it in the cloud. It gives me the flexibility to kind of figure out what I'm doing as I'm going.
This is Neil Guernsey at SGT. I want to weigh in here because we've been trying to do the same thing, and it's an interesting challenge to get in there. I've got a background in cloud. I was one of the early managed service providers, and I've gone the route of buy versus build, meaning buy software as a service when possible. If not, hosted management is good. And it came down to, as we're going through the same sort of thing, 15-year-old technologies and how we're going to move forward. We're kind of settling on Office 365 and Azure is our approach going forward, and it is very daunting, as you kind of understand. And the key is to either, in our case, we're lucky. We just hired somebody that's really strong in Azure, SharePoint, and Office 365, and he's providing guidance for us going forward to help us, navigate the pitfalls. But picking something like Office 365 that encompasses a lot of what you're talking about is the way that we kind of settled on our approach to do that, because as we learn that, we're going to be learning more of the hybrid type merging of those technologies.
Mm-hmm. How do you guys envision managing? So you have one set of challenges internally, which may be hardware or just staff skills training. How are you going to address the managing of those resources as they move outside your four walls?
Part of it is reaching out and getting in bed with some of the providers and understanding them, getting a partnership going, kind of like we've done with Red Zone, and having those discussions in terms of how do you manage it. You stay in constant communication. It's how do you manage any project is communication. And it works pretty well the more you're in touch with them and until you get to the real comfort level. And it's the maturity of a relationship. It is the key. I've had that before from my previous stint with my previous company. And the companies that, when I say interacted with you really well, you found it easy to manage. The ones that just were hard to reach is a big warning sign. And if you've got that type of a relationship where you can call them up and say, I got a problem here, and we work together, that's the best way to do it.
Bill, this is Jim DePietro on that question. And Neil, you just mentioned, I believe, that you hired someone who's very strong in 365 and Azure, and that kind of made me think, I would like to have somebody on my staff or have some knowledge myself of the technology so that I can better manage the external resources. Is that why you did it, or did that hire just fall in place?
Neil, I was lucky. That hire just fell in place, and I would highly recommend it if you can make it happen. But if not, what I've done in the past is I have sent people to extensive training. You make the investment, you either hire somebody to come in and do it for you, or you make the investment and send somebody off to 3 weeks of training. That's the price of entry, if you will.
Yeah, we're not going to go blind, from our standpoint. We're going to have somebody in-house that's familiar with the technology.
So, Nick, back to your points from earlier, are you anticipating that this is one of the ways that you may be able to get around inheriting a legacy team and being able to kind of keep pace with adding new services so you got the human being challenge, which is, I guess most of you just can't throw someone off the team if you have a real cultural issue. I mean, this is across the board where many of you have gotten started and have to sort of make team changes and absorb this. But then if you put something in the cloud, essentially you may be able to go faster. Is that how you're looking at it, or is there a different way you're approaching it? And I'll address that to Nick.
For me, the hybrid cloud is a necessary part of the transformation, right? In the old days, I could build all the skill sets I needed, and I knew where I could get them, and everything was somewhat clear, although I'll be the first to admit at the time it didn't seem like it. What the cloud forces me to do is to think about the skill sets that I want to keep in-house strategically, and then which ones I want to manage via terms and conditions. And so I find myself, as I start to look at the team, I want project managers, for example, with business savvy, with experience managing contracts. and speaking with the legal team internally and the finance team and things like that. So I start to look at those skill sets, and then I start to look at the core technology team and say, what do I want to keep around for the future? And that's a lot of architecture. That's a lot of thought leadership and really kind of core developers. But everything else, I start to look at the cloud and say, how can I solve this in a different business way than maybe in the past?
This is Jim Gorig. I can second that. That's largely the position we're taking too. We're really looking at where do we want our core competencies to be, and more that comes down to we want a business-focused, oriented team that's solving business problems and bringing that knowledge to bear in that regard, as opposed to worrying about managing our exchange environment or document management environment or anything that might make sense that can be done better and routinely by someone else.
So with that, the data is now between two locations or your own internal locations, plus now potentially in different cloud sources. And a couple of you have brought up security as a question. Jim Gorig had questions about frameworks and controls and strategies with validating and reporting compliance. And Nick has mentioned that he wants to build a team. He's been tasked with building a team from scratch, focused on information security. So how do you do that with this sprawling new architecture?
This is Neil. I understand what you're saying. You got to start somewhere in terms of you got to find at least one key individual that has some experience in either the outsourcing area or, like you said, pick the area where you're most concerned about. And it's sometimes worthwhile to bring in a consultant. We've done that in the past to work with us to build a plan, if you will, or at least an approach and come up with a project plan for it. And during those discussions, you help build a little bit of the framework and the concerns and issues and identify more of what you need in terms of either the skills, training, or resources to go, because it's really hard to do it the blank sheet of paper and trying to figure out how you're doing it yourself, which is part of my problem with some of my issues that I've got. There's so much area that really needs to be revamped that we have to bring in some of the key resources that know what they're talking about to ask the hard questions of us to make us learn where we want to go. And I think that's part of the issue that a lot of people get is paralysis by analysis type thing.
This is Don Wigner. We approached it from what I call an onion approach. There was layers. So we compartmentalized, understood that to your point about paralysis by analysis, instead of trying to solve for the 100% goal, was trying to segment and break out incremental wins and bringing in both a combination of talent from the outside to join our team as well as partners. And the partners were used at various levels. They could either be augmentation to the existing team or more of an advisory role, helping us do assessments and giving us insight into what's going on in the industry around us. And then that helped us define and evolve our roadmap. And then we kept a very fluid roadmap and that it was constantly evolving. So we would go through those small incremental wins, and then we would quickly, obviously, readdress the roadmap and continue to set the bar higher and higher so that we could have success and continue to get everything from hygiene items to more strategic capability items in place so that we were seeing success in making that progress, but not feeling overwhelmed, which sometimes happens across the teams when you lay out an overly long and complex plan with them, and we saw a lot of success in doing it that way.
Thanks for the input, Don. There's a piece that came up that is related. Four of you were talking about building bench strength, building teams. And it was interesting. We started out the conversation about potentially how to go fast and how to get more done quicker. And essentially the cloud potentially gives us the ability to sidestep staffing problems or issues or challenges or cultural roadblocks and essentially put the foot on the accelerator if you want to go in a certain direction. But then we still got to come back to the team itself. And I really would like to, we did this about literally 8 years ago. And I'd love to come up with some ideas of what people kind of quick success stories that everybody's having so we can come away with 5, 6, 7, 8 success stories of what people individually may have done to build their strength of their team, to deal with any cultural challenges that may be, to help kind of swing the ship so that it's a faster, more agile environment for your team. So who wants to get started with that?
Well, this is Neil. I'd like to talk about what I did in my previous understand as CIO, and I've kind of done the same thing here, albeit in a different way, is when you build the bench strength, you come in, you analyze what you've got in terms of your team and how well they're working together. And while everybody wants to look for the strengths, one of the key things I did was had to look for the weaknesses. And those are the areas where you've got people that are sucking energy out of your current team and figuring out what's holding them all back. A lot of people want to be doing more, but you've got some individuals out there that either think they know everything and try and drive it the way they want, and people eventually try to give up trying to move things forward and finding a way to move them out of the organization. If you can't change them, most people with that type of an attitude, you really can't change them, and you have to make the hard decision to let them go. That's a big challenge, and it's very tough on some people, but I found in many cases over the years that just eliminating one or two people can really energize a team when you realize how much they're dragging the rest of the core team down and stifling their energy and enthusiasm.
Thanks, Neil. Who else wants to add to that?
This is Jim DePietro. I recently started at a new company last year. I was with my other company for 27 years. I pretty much built the team and had the team I wanted and, was at a tweaking level. But now at this new company, I have some interesting situations, and one of the things I've recently started doing is I call forced delegation. I've got one IT manager here that pretty much is the know-it-all, knows everything, does everything, and is involved in everything. So we started bringing other people into the fray and kind of forced delegation there. While initially it was a little concerning for the manager, we found that the resources that are receiving the delegated work are really, some of them are starting to blossom, and we're starting to see some things move. It's been a couple of months in the works right now, and I think the manager is getting more comfortable with it now. So it was a little rough first, but it's starting to bear fruit now. So that's my forced delegation concept.
So can you explain that, Jim? Literally, can you just break that down a little bit more detail? I think I know what you mean, but I'd love for you to give an example.
Yeah, I mean, when we're talking about various technical issues, whether it's in the applications, email or Word or Office, again, this one manager would funnel everything through himself and address a lot of issues without having that main point person. So we're trying to identify point people for various applications or various disciplines within the organization so they have kind of ownership over an area. And the manager's still involved, obviously, but we're trying to give these people more identities and more ownership over an area of the business, an area of the technology. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you.
This is Nick. I'm seeing something that's related that's very similar. I find myself breaking up committees. I find committees in a lot of places where 6 people are solving a problem that 2 people can solve if they know they've got responsibility and accountability to do that. And so sometimes it's just spending the day breaking up committee meetings and kind of making sure people understand what they're responsible for, and making sure the follow-up's in there to kind of prevent the groupthink that leads to inefficiency.
Nick, that's a great idea. Can you give us like a situation where that happened, that you came out like just something that's specific related to that?
Well, for example, I've got a team that's supporting Salesforce, and the developer would go to a meeting, the business analyst, the manager, and then my senior director who owns that, and they would invite me to the meeting. And, so my first question is what's the point? And what are all these people doing going, right? I got a no ferns policy for meetings. If you don't have an active rule, get the hell out. And so it's just really kind of setting that and explaining to people that, we should trust our people to do their work. If they're not, then let's get them to coaching. But I don't want to see meetings with 3 levels of management in there. That's pointless and unnecessary.
This is Don. What's interesting about that is one challenge I had, it's similar. There was the mass attendance, so a lot of consensus trying to be built, but the other item was the chain of command structure where I had people feeling that they can't talk directly to one another. And to your point about empowering people and telling them not only do you own this, but you're accountable and responsible for it. And the whole notion of silos, the org structure isn't a communication structure, and therefore you're expected to work with your peers. You're supposed to take initiative and contact them. 2-3 years ago was a foreign concept, and now there's still issues that bubble up here and there, but it's largely gone due to some of the themes you shared, which is telling staff what the bar is they have to work for, telling them what they own. By all means, get input where input is applicable, but it's not a democracy. It's, do an assessment, make a recommendation. If it needs to get approval, and then move forward. But you own, and you're accountable for it.
Yeah, this is Neil. I want to kind of weigh in on that one as well, because a lot of times your second level management can be a hindrance when they feel like they've got to be supervising their team in some of these decisions. Maybe you have two departments and you need a decision between the two, and the managers feel that they have to be involved when really the two technicians could probably solve it a lot better. And it's tough, and sometimes you have to kind of jump in and say, I want to help the managers out. I want to put these two together, have them come up and give us a recommendation of what they think should be happening, rather than having the meeting with the managers involved trying to steer that decision. I think it's in their makeup as a manager feeling like they're not worthwhile unless they're directing those types of things. I think if you try teaching the managers how to be more of a director level type thing, to say that, no, we want to review what you have to do and we'll tell you how we want to fine tune it, but we need you guys to come up with a basic recommendation. And that's one way to kind of also empower the team as part of the team development type activities as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is Jim DePietro. I'll just make one more comment here that I found myself saying more and more to the management levels is you've gotten to the manager level because you've been successful as a technician in a lot of cases. But the higher you go in the organization, the more it's about them and less about you in terms of them being successful, the team being successful. And that's how you get your rewards. And that's hard for some people to understand, but that's really key to growing in management, I guess.
How about Jim Gurry? Any comments related to that?
No, I think that's accurate in what everyone's saying. It's certainly interesting because I've had similar conversations, and I find that oftentimes we are dealing with individuals at the management level that did get there through the technical chain, and that understanding of a shift in mentality to helping others succeed and become successful is the core of your job. And sometimes I think that that's just a conversation that should be had on a regular basis and reinforced, because it does really require individuals to think differently about their jobs and what their goals are.
Several of you have said have individuals on staff that hold the keys to a lot of knowledge. And how do you culturally open that Pandora box up so that it's spread across your team so that you actually have a team that is deep? Does anybody want to share some wins that they've had either in their current job or previous where they've been able to build the team and really enforce a culture of sharing and not having a single points of information or people information silo expertise?
Well, this is Jim DePietro again. That's kind of one of my hot topics here. You need to create a safe environment. People need to know that they can open up, they can share information, and then somebody's not going to take their job. I mean, everybody kind of has some domain that they want to be responsible for. And that goes back to the issue we talked about before, the silos or the people doing their jobs versus managing everything by committee. It's a slippery slope on both sides, really. But I think the key to it is having a safe environment where everyone can contribute and not have repercussions to what they say, and basically getting the team to work together by opening up. Safe environment is really the key. And I don't know that I can say specifically what I'm doing to make that happen. A lot of communication, a lot of reassurances, getting people involved. But that's kind of the key, is creating that safe environment, in my opinion.
This is Don. The one thing that I found that was really helpful with that, and I still have challenges, please don't get me wrong, that there's not a challenge at times because of personality types, but that was one of the key things. We've done a couple exercises, we do it at least once a year with our teams, where we actually go through with HR and they help us work with our team, and as a group, each individual identifies what type of personality type they have, whether they're a driver, an analytic, relationship driven, or they're more amenable. And it helps not only them understand how they normally react to things, it also helps identify what are the pieces of data or information they need to get up and go and be able to act and be more aggressive versus passive or waiting on the side before taking action. And that's helped a lot. It's helped a lot with communications. It's helped a lot with alleviating people feeling that they've been somehow disrespected in different types of communication styles. And it's really helped for the management team, my team in particular, because They now understand what they need to kind of give to each of their team members. They need to make them autonomous and let them act and move on their own. And that's been a great success overall. We've done it 3 years in a row now, and it has positive results each year.
Did you bring a firm in to do that type of work, or did your HR department skilled in that, Don?
Yeah, unfortunately, our HR department, we have a learning and development arm that does it, so it's a large enough HR team, they run it. But there is a book, which is slipping my mind at the moment, I'll do a quick search, but that walks through the social styles, and that's really the anchor of the whole workshop. And just the HR person is well versed in it and able to help you facilitate it.
That's interesting. About 10 years ago, I did that at my company, and it's still the technical guys on my team. It was really interesting to see the quadrants and the personality styles of the different folks on the team. And still to this day, they refer back to it. It was a pretty good exercise. Has anybody else done anything similar where they've either done that type of a personality style assessment or brought a firm in or had their HR department engage in one?
This is Jim Gorig. Yes, we do a Myers-Briggs assessment with the team and help people understand different communication styles. And we found that to be tremendously helpful. It gives people a touchstone, somewhere to go to help understand why they may be getting reactions from certain people and how they respond and what the best way is to approach those individuals. And we found that that's been tremendously helpful in increasing the level of teamwork and understanding. So, we eliminate a lot of the miscommunications and problems that way. I think we've also found that when we're dealing with linchpin employees, typically that comes about as a result of perhaps someone with a mentality that they think keeping the knowledge is some kind of job security for them, and controlling particular areas it contributes to that. And having conversations with those individuals, letting them know and aligning the incentives for them so that they are sharing the information and responsibility more, we find to be very helpful as well. I've had success with that in the past.
Can you give an example of an incentive aligning an incentive? Maybe there's several people that know how to do that, but I'd be interested in hearing how you aligned incentives to, I love that word, linchpin employee. So maybe you could spend a moment talking about that.
Certainly, we've had experience in the past where we maybe have had a engineer who became the core engineer on the team, and suddenly everything was going through that individual. It was vetted by that person, or their opinion on it was the opinion that ruled. So what we did is we approached that employee and changed the incentive form. Rather than you being the decision maker on it, what we'd like to see from you is you be able to help the other engineers and employees around you get to the decision themselves. And then we're going to base your success on how well you're able to accomplish that goal, and give you, whether it's economic incentives or commendation or recognition for that. And it took a little time for us to get there, but eventually that person started seeing themselves as someone who should be helping others, and to spread it around so that we weren't in a position where that individual was the only one with either the knowledge or the ability to say yes or no to something.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Can anybody else jump in there and add something?
Tagging on to that, just briefly, this is Jim Gorig again. Another thing that we did in that respect is we put together what we called roundtables, where we had individuals, they picked a pertinent new technology or area of interest to their particular functional area or team, and then they were responsible for presenting and teaching that information to the rest of the team. And we found a couple of things came out of that. One, the individuals became more confident in their own knowledge about something, because when you're forced to explain something, you have to understand it well yourself. Two, it increased the knowledge of the overall team. Three, it gave some credibility to that person as someone who was expert or knowledgeable in that area. And oftentimes, that may have been something different for them or overlapping with another individual, which helped us be able to cross-train people. So we'd say pick something outside of your comfort zone or something that's different from what you do.
No, that's a great suggestion. Don, I'm going to pick on you. Is that okay?
Yep, that's fine.
Only because I kind of know some of your background, and to build on Jim Gorig's ideas, and actually everybody's kind of throwing their hat in the ring on this one. But I would be interested in, so Don has some good blog posts on LinkedIn. He's got some very interesting information regarding to personnel, people management, and Don, maybe you can explain how you built your high performance team. Maybe you can reference some of your blog posts that you talked about as you built your team to collapse your data centers on that worldwide project you were sharing with me a couple months ago.
Sure, no problem at all. So, I mean, a lot of this has been, I've been with CB for 4 years, so it's been a journey. That's like most of our roles. But in doing so, I encountered in the early days a lot of the challenges that the rest of you have mentioned on the phone, as well as some of the things I shared already. And a lot of it was trying to figure out what's the framework or an environment that will allow the team to be successful. And one of the things that stuck out to me early on was a lot about empowerment, a lot of people being shy, like you mentioned just a couple seconds ago. You know, you'd have one strong personality, or others didn't feel that they had the authority to act. Someone didn't have the skills to act, or didn't feel that they had the latitude to grow beyond what they had already been asked to do. And the theme that started sticking out, that I had seen this in my previous job also, but it carried over and proved true with CEB, was kind of that holistic view of the staff member, that, you know, we tend to hire people based off an org chart. We also tend to hire people off a specific role. We want you to do this. And I think most of you would agree that if you really sat down and talked with a lot of your staff members, you'd find out that, you know, they have a lot more to offer than you're necessarily asking them to contribute. And, you know, examples of that are, you've had engineers that were hired to do servers, for example, and you find out they have a networking background, or they were SharePoint administrators at one point, or you get the example of hiring somebody and you were lucky enough to get someone who knew Azure, for example. But that holistic view was an interesting concept, and it was hard to figure out how do you structure the team and allow them to leverage and grow outside their walls, per se. A lot of that siloing that tends to happen. And what we decided to do was a couple things. One, there was a bunch of foundational items we needed to fix because the teams were drowning in just dealing with a lot of the day-to-day noise, as well as the functional dysfunction, I should say, across those team personalities. And first thing we focused on was kind of getting the house in order, which was fixing the foundational items, putting a lot more matured organization and process around what we were doing, where process made sense. And then once we got kind of the noise to stop distracting the teams, then we were able to start talking to them about where do we go from here. They were so used to, like you mentioned, having a strong personality on the team. They were so used to having an authoritarian or a dictatorship, per se, that the rest of the team had all these ideas and previous experiences and so forth that no one was aware of or weren't being, you know, considered or contributing into the overall planning and road mapping. So we started setting up windows where the team members could start to participate. We opened up an idea forum, set up just an internet site where any staff member across the whole organization could post either a recommendation based off something they're seeing, previous experiences, anything they had that they felt would better the organization, whether that's from a service delivery standpoint to the business or even internal processes. And that was interesting because at first I would say that stumbled a little bit. It was almost everyone was afraid. But once we started getting groups posting, the collaboration started taking off because one person would post a theme and then other people would chime in saying, yep, I've thought about that, or I've seen that before. This is how we did it at my old company. And it helped a lot. And then what we did is we would, as a management team, we would review those ideas and circle back monthly. We still do this with the team and say, here's the 5 ideas or 10 ideas that were recommended. We're taking these 3. One will get implemented this month. The other 2 will be done within the next 90 days. And as soon as we did that the first time, then morale bumped up. People started getting more and more engaged. The other thing we did is we started looking at projects, mostly internal projects. And much like we look at, do we need staff augmenting from outside, we started saying, well, we have an internal resource pool. We have people, like I said, that were hired with skill sets that we were not leveraging, and that's not our current role. And what we started doing is posting our projects as on a job board almost, where other staff members, one, they get visibility of what's going on across the organization, but 2, they can apply to participate as part of that project. It's similar. It's a little bit of a hybrid. I have family and friends that have worked for DoD contractors like Lockheed and all. And if you think about how they sustain themselves, they're always shopping themselves around to find another project. It's not that level, but it's a similar concept just internally for career development, as well as getting that expertise that you may not realize you have to contributors. They'll post the role. They'll say, here's a project. Let's say in networking, we need someone who knows routing. We need someone who has done racking and cabling and whatever the project spec may be. And of course, we have network engineers who will do it, but we'll open up one or two slots on a project for two different types of roles. Number one, first type of role would be, I have experience and I've done this before, so therefore I can be almost a peer contributor skill set wise. And number two is what I call a mentor role, meaning I don't know a darn thing about networking, but I'd really like to get some understanding now about that and have some experience as part of this project. So it's more of a learning role where they participate at a very junior level, but the team members spend time explaining to them what's going on, teaching them a bit about what they do day to day. And that goes a long way for opening up ideas to different people, especially junior people, about what career path they may want to take later down the road.
That's great, Don. Thanks for sharing that.
Okay.
I didn't know about the project board. That's an interesting idea.
There's a question. This is Jim DePietro for Don. That all sounds really great. So the people that would volunteer to participate on a project, I guess they would have excess capacity that they would. How would you work out the timing that they would have time to work on those projects along with their existing work?
Sure. So they have to get approval from their manager. So normally what's interesting is everyone is at capacity until there's something that they want to do. And so my experience has been that when you give them that opportunity, they find a way to cover their existing responsibilities while still being able to find cycles to participate. And if they truly can't, the managers do try the best they can to have other team members provide coverage when it can be done to give that individual an opportunity. I mean, this isn't something where every day of the week you're out for all year long working on other projects besides your responsibility. It's probably a once or twice a year at most event where you're offline for 6 to 12 weeks max working on a project, and it's only going to be a smaller subset of your overall job responsibilities, because obviously if it became a full-time position, your job's not getting done. But that's something that if they're interested in it, they apply for it, they get approval from their direct manager, and there's a coverage plan. But like I said, ironically, I would say almost 95+% of the time, everyone who's maxed out and too busy finds time and an ability to not only cover their regular job, but do the activities because they're interested and they want to do it.
Well, that sounds like a great environment, because that's always a challenge, is keeping, the retention of people is giving them exposure to different things and keeping them challenged. Sounds like you've got to work in here. That's great.
It's not perfect. Nothing's perfect, right? But I think in general, it does help with attrition. I mean, attrition levels are minimal now. We have less than 3% overall, which has gone well. And, I want to say when I first got there, we were at about 12% attrition. So people, were busy, were run down, were working, but it was working to work, not working because they were part of it and energized by it and wanting to contribute and do it. So we've been very fortunate we've been able to shift that, but it's been a team effort. The management team and the staff have all contributed in and helped develop this, and we continually improve it. We take their ideas, and if they recommend things, we look to see how can we do it. But it's definitely a leap of faith to get your manager to first start doing that, because it is painful at first. It feels like it's overhead and it's more difficult, but it's kind of like anything. Once it gets momentum, it continues to almost run on its own and it becomes normal at that point.
Well, I think we've spent some time on the staff part. Is there any residual questions, or can I move on to a different topic at this point? Okay, so let's slide into the next major theme, which popped up as security. But actually, I think I'd like Jim Gorey to ask your question. He wrote a very nice question regarding information security under his profile there. And knowing what I know about everybody, I know Nick and Don and others are in a similar situation. And I'd like him to address it from his framework and controls, sort of at that strategy program perspective. So Jim, why don't I let you open it up and then we'll see how far we get in the next 15 minutes related to this. And then I do want to leave a couple minutes at the end for Jim DiPietro's last question, which I think will be relevant to everyone as well. So go ahead, Jim.
Okay, great. Basically, we're embarking on really taking a hard look at ISO 27001. And as we get into the project, are discovering more and more that while we can put the controls in place and meet the objectives, we need to be able to monitor and manage that on an ongoing basis, ensure that those controls are being adhered to and that we're able to track changes in that environment. We can validate any changes that are happening and then be able to report on those. What we've discovered is that's largely a manual process. And my question really is around, is there a way to do that in such a way that it's easier, it's not so highly manual, that you're able to get that information to track, validate, and report it? At the moment, it seems like a large commitment of individual time to be able to accomplish that.
And you're talking about, in particular, processes supporting your individual controls within the organization, Jim?
That's correct.
This is Neil. Can you give an example of some of the controls you're talking about that you're having trouble with?
Well, I think it's more of a general question of tracking any changes to your program or incidents that you may have or anything that you may need to catalog and report on at a later date.
So this is Don. We've been using, and we use different tools for different things. So we have HPSM as our ticketing system. We've rolled out their CMDB product, which is tracking our SOC systems now for changes. And now that gives us the reporting. There still is, to your point, a little bit of a manual component where I have a team member that will look at that output to make sure that any of the ones that are flagged as potentially being rogue changes are indeed rogue. And then we address them through process and management, so staff members get a warning and so forth. Other areas we do use Varonis pretty heavily for different other reports that we provide to the auditors. But it depends on the controls. Each control, there's not, to your point, a one-size-fits-all solution. We do use some risk management tools also, which helps us track and do some of the reporting that makes the auditors happy, which is Abriska is the product that we call it right now.
Don, could you repeat the two products that you mentioned? You mentioned Varonis, Abriska, and what was the one that does the controls?
HPSM, HP Service Manager.
Okay.
It has an add-on for both asset management and configuration management that complement one another. You inventory all the assets, and then you're able to monitor them for change. And then it counts for any of the file system changes that the auditors normally want to look for code deployments or anything else. And then if there's not an active change for that time window already approved in the system, then it calls it out as a potential rogue change, and then you have to do some investigating to validate whether it is or isn't. But that's helped a lot with the auditors, because that was one of the big flags that they kept raising was, how do you really know that all your changes are being managed properly? Abriska is a risk management product, so it's a combination of, we run a risk program, so in our security team, we have a round table with the business. It's called Risk Champions. We go through different risk items that the business is identifying, that we've identified. We get collaboration on how we're going to train and or communicate and monitor those items with the business. But we also use that same tool for doing our risk assessments, tracking of remediation activities. When we do our white hat and cyber trust scans, we put those findings into that tracking tool so we can show that it's been remediated and what was found. And then we also take some of those other feed points in that are CAN type reports that go into it, so the auditors also they have a one-stop shop, but it answers a lot of their questions, and it's one place to have it as a repository.
What have you been reviewing, Jim, at this point? What kind of tools have you looked into?
Well, we're just beginning this process, so we actually have Varonis available to us, which I find interesting. I'd like to look into that more. It's good to know that that's got some of that capability. And certainly the HP Service Manager sounds like that's exactly the direction that we need to be looking. So it's good to have that input.
Yeah, Varonis is a completely rock star product. I just want to put that out there for anybody who's looking and doing any sort of data governance, any sort of really getting their hands around security at the core, versus just deploying a castle approach. If you want to start getting really intelligent about your core, definitely a significant product to look at. Anybody else want to throw any comments in there? I know people are at different points of maturity within their information security program, so I wanted to hit it at this higher level first. But anybody other than Jim and Don want to comment to that from either the standards or tools that they're using to manage their information security program overall? Okay, so I have a very cool question that I want to throw out there. It's actually not my question, it's Jim DePietro's. Jim, why don't you ask it, because it's better coming from you. And I know there's going to be a lot of people that are going to have some. So my objective in Jim asking this question is that we come out with ideas. So what are some success stories? What are people doing? And Jim DePietro, why don't you get started there, and then we'll just roll with it and see what people throw out for ideas.
Yeah, okay. Looking at IT as a service organization, we serve our internal clients. When you release a tool, like a BI tool or a platform or some computing environment that your managers and user community really need to adopt and take on, what types of things do you do to reduce the time required to get them to adopt, buy in, to integrate that application or platform into your company? I've done a number of things, but I'm curious to see what other things you guys have done to actually, again, try and get that new service, new platform, new product into their hands and used and actually up and running, integrated into the company.
This is Neil. I'll throw that out. When we rolled out SharePoint the first time years ago, when it was SharePoint 2003, we worked with some of the key business units that were involved. We gave a demo of the overall kind of system capabilities to them and asked, is there anybody here that's really interested in learning more, before telling them really where we're going with it. And out of that, we got some people that showed an interest, and those we offered to give them roles in the development to weigh in as customer representatives, and they became our key trainers and evangelists in those organizations because they could see the benefits early on. And they were coming up with ideas and actually taking it back to the business unit and sharing some of the ideas. Hey, we've got these ideas. And more people actually jumped on the bandwagon with it. And when we had the real good, all it takes is one good key individual that is outgoing is enough to bring it back and get excited about it. And that's what it's going to take in one case. And the other way is to start, if you don't have that type of evangelist, keep kind of throwing out, when I say key features of things that are coming and letting them know early on. The worst thing you can do is wait until you've got the system already developed and then show it to them and expect them to just jump on board. You got to figure out, how do you get some interest up front to build an attitude of looking forward to it is kind of a key thing you got to do.
Thanks, Neil. Nick, what about yourself? I know you're relatively new there, but you can even ideas from your previous organization would be great.
It's similar to what was just described. So right now we're in the process of rolling out Kimball, which is a time tracking system that sits on the Force.com platform. A lot of the more recent technologies almost sell themselves in terms of their functionality, their ability to be used on mobile platforms, things like that. And so we've done targeted demos for a lot of different constituencies that were targeted specifically for them and how it would solve their problems and what they get out of it. And by taking that tailored approach, we've gotten a tremendous amount of enthusiasm to move forward, and people are kind of almost begging to get the solution first.
So let's break that down, though. Two of you said the same thing. I think it's great. Can you give an example of like how you build the enthusiasm? It's setting up a meeting. I know that Neil, you mentioned doing a PowerPoint. I'd be interested in Nick, for yourself. Like, what are some specific things you're doing?
So, for example, we took a software and we did a specific demo for the finance team. And before we did that, we had a good understanding from them of what problems they were dealing with on a day-to-day basis and what they would change. That was very different than the professional services team when we went to them and showed them the same software, but a very different use case in terms of how it solves it for them. And then again, that was very different when we went to HR and what they would get out of the system. And so just that tailored approach, and that, number one, demonstrating the understanding of what the real business problems were, and then showing them a solution and giving them a response before we signed a contract, went a long way towards people saying, yes, you guys know what my issues are, and you're doing things to solve my issues.
This is Neil, and I did something similar, but I took it a step earlier. When we were first considering a system, you get the vendor to give demos of it, and some of their things, and you have those business people in those meetings because you want them to weigh in. Sometimes they help you sell it, but then you go back to those business people, like you said, from the different units, and you say, how do you see this helping you guys? And you do that independently, not necessarily, you don't have to do it in the whole group, because sometimes somebody's really loud and will take over. But you go back and say, did you see anything there that interested you? And if you get, and sometimes they go, no, not really. But if you say, well, this feature, whatever, and then you start asking them a little question, you have to kind of draw them out a little bit and say, well, how do you see you would use that differently? How would that help you? Now you get them hooked, kind of like a salesperson. And you can kind of do that. But like I said, take advantage of the vendors and have them demonstrate some of the core capabilities of what you want to do.
Anybody else want to add to it?
This is Don. I think the only thing I would add is very similar in theme is everyone likes to feel special. And what I found is similar, that we'll have partners that we'll bring in and they feel like they're getting, the inside scoop per se. And they wind up being your line advocate. So not only do they get to pilot or test something, they would get access maybe before the rest of the population as you're doing development and testing. But then they're talking in the hallways and giving insights out. And then when it comes time for the rollout, in some cases, not all, we've actually even had those pilot users be the ones with the signature block on the comms, going out to their business lines, telling them about it, and that they've participated, and here's what's coming, and here's your contacts in IT, and why they're doing it. But it's coming from them instead of from us.
It's funny, several years ago, I forget who it was, one of the CIOs said, what percentage of your time is spent internally selling, building consensus, and marketing the message? And he said, well over 50%. Would everybody concur, or was that percentage too high?
I would concur. This is Neil. I mean, sometimes if you really want it, it depends on how well you think you need to sell it, because it's one thing. We as technologists, I have to admit, I'm probably one of the most guilty people, but one of the hardest things to do is organizational change management. And that's what you're talking about, getting them to change the way they do things. I'm facing that right now because we're rolling out Link, and I'm going through an exercise of how do I get the buzz going? How do I get people trained up? The worst thing, I've done it before. I rolled something out, and you think if you build it, they will come, the field of dreams type thing. That doesn't work. You've got to get them excited about it and somebody willing to get in there and try it, because if you just throw it to them cold and they've got an alternate way of doing something, they're not going to do it. You've got to get the buzz going, and it's a PR, it's a sales campaign that you're going through when we're rolling it out here and trying to get people excited about it and get a few, the pilot group, make sure you're using people that are vocal on it, that can, number one, give you some good feedback, and number two, tell others about it. But it's a question of, if it's a really critical project, that's the more selling and demonstration training, and like you said, getting them in the test mode, and then doing the surveys to find out, how is this going to change your life? I mean, versus what you're doing now, and get those use cases to show where you're going to see the advantages. And that's key. But that's a people thing. We're so used to making technology bend to our whim, and we're pretty good at that, or we wouldn't be where we're at. It's another thing to get people to change, and that's what we're dealing with here. Is how do you get somebody that, everything's working, why are you giving me something new? And that's typically what happens. They want to resist it. I had a previous case where, in a previous job, where we were building a new customer service workstation for FedEx employees way back when, and this was back in the green screen days, when everybody, the person that really had all the codes memorized, that they could whip through the screen and do it themselves, they were the stars because they could just do things quickly. But when you had a high turnover in a customer service environment, the young people that came in and were expected to, they got to learn all this stuff. This is before the GUI interfaces. When we did come out with the GUI, we didn't have to sell it to the new people. They thought it was wonderful. But the older people, they lost a lot of people over that because they didn't get them trained up and expecting it. And to them, that was a hindrance because they were losing their status. So you have to deal with the people type issues anytime you introduce a change to the process.
Well, thanks, Neil, for those final words. And I Just want to let you know there's a lot of wisdom on the phone, and I really appreciate all of you, Jim, Neil, Nick, and Don, for coming on and sharing your wisdom with the group. There's a lot of horsepower on the phone here, and we covered a lot of ground, tried to develop some depth, so some quick takeaways. Much of this probably we already know, but it's always great to hear it again and be repeated as you develop your own strategies and plans. So I appreciate all of you. I've only asked you for an hour, so we're right at a little over that right now. But if you have any comments or suggestions to improve or to add to the group for next time, if you want to participate again, please let me know. But with that, also know that you can join the LinkedIn group and continue any conversation on the LinkedIn group. I just have CIOs on there. I don't open it up to vendors, so you could go on and communicate that way. I'll also provide email addresses and phone numbers to all of you, so that if you want to have offline conversations with each other, you may. So I thank you very much, everybody, and we're wrapped up for today.
I've got 3 more hours free. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
You're welcome. Take care. So there you have it, another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. I want to say thank you to our sponsors, Red Zone Technologies, for delivering world-class IT security assessments and IT security managed services. Also to ThunderDG. ThunderDG is a system that allows you to electronically manage your security policies and your IT security quizzes that support your policies. So with that, until the next episode, I'm signing off. So there you have it. This wraps another episode of Bill Murphy's Red Zone podcast. To get all the relevant show notes, please go to our blog at www.redzonetech.net/podcast. Additionally, make sure you go to iTunes and leave your comments in iTunes about the show. This helps our show rankings enormously and it helps support the show. Until next time, I appreciate you very much for listening. Thank you.